In the heart of Akron, Ohio, surrounded by the smokestacks and factories that made this city the rubber capital of the world, stands something completely unexpected. A Tudor Revival manor house that looks like it was transported brick by brick from the English countryside. 65 rooms, 64,500 square feet, the sixth largest house open to the public in the United States. This is Stan Hywet Hall, and it tells a uniquely American story about ambition, innovation, loss, and redemption. The man who built it, Franklin Augustus Seiberling, started with nothing. By 40, he had built one of the most successful companies in American history. By 60, he'd lost it all in the Great Depression. But through it all, this house remained, a testament to the Gilded Age dream that you could create your own English manor on American soil if you just worked hard enough and got lucky enough. Stan Hywet is more than just another mansion. It's where Will Rogers entertained, where Shirley Temple performed as a child, where the modern self-help movement was born on a single afternoon in 1935, where medieval aesthetics met 20th century technology in ways that seemed like magic. This is the story of the house, the man who built it, and the American rubber industry that made it all possible. Franklin Augustus Seiberling was born in 1859 in Western Star, Ohio, a small farming community that has long since vanished from the maps. His father, John Frederick Seiberling, was a German immigrant who had worked his way up from farmhand to successful businessman. By the time Frank, as everyone called him, was a teenager, his father owned a manufacturing company in Akron that produced farm machinery, particularly reapers and mowers. Frank grew up working in his father's business, learning manufacturing, management, and the art of mechanical innovation from the ground up. He attended Heidelberg College but didn't graduate, instead choosing to dive deeper into the family business. In the 1880s, he married Gertrude Penfield, a well-educated woman from a respectable Akron family. Together they would have 6 children and build one of America's great fortunes. But first came disaster. In 1887, John Frederick Seiberling's manufacturing company failed. The panic of that year, combined with increased competition and some poor business decisions, led to bankruptcy. The family lost everything. Frank, now in his late 20s with a growing family, found himself starting from scratch. For the next decade, Frank Seiberling scrambled. He tried various business ventures, he worked for other companies, he looked for opportunities, and he watched as Akron began to transform around him. The city was becoming the center of a new industry, rubber manufacturing. Companies like B.F. Goodrich, founded in 1870, were proving that fortunes could be made in this strange new material that came from trees in South America and Southeast Asia. By 1898, at age 39, Seiberling saw his chance. A vacant factory building in East Akron came up for sale. It had been a strawboard and cereal mill. Seiberling didn't have the money to buy it outright, but he had something more valuable, a vision and the ability to convince others to believe in that vision. He borrowed money, he brought in investors, he mortgaged everything he could, and on August 29, 1898, he founded the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company with his brother Charles as a partner. The name was a tribute to Charles Goodyear, who had died nearly 40 years earlier after discovering the vulcanization process that made rubber practical for industrial use. Goodyear himself had died in poverty, but his invention had spawned an industry. Seiberling and his brother would succeed where the inventor had failed. The timing was perfect. The automobile industry was just beginning to emerge. Bicycles were wildly popular and needed tires. The rubber industry was poised for explosive growth, but timing alone wouldn't guarantee success. Frank Seiberling proved to be a brilliant innovator and businessman. Within a a few years, Goodyear was thriving. Seiberling pioneered new manufacturing techniques. He focused obsessively on quality control. He understood that in the early automobile industry, reliability was everything. A tire failure could be deadly, and drivers needed to trust the brand on their wheels. Goodyear tires earned that trust. By 1901, Goodyear had sales of over $100,000. By 1905, it had passed 1 million. The company expanded rapidly, building new factories, hiring thousands of workers, developing new products. Seiberling was aggressive, competitive, and willing to take risks. He invested heavily in research and development. He bought out competitors. He secured contracts with major automobile manufacturers. The growth was staggering. By 1912, Goodyear was the largest tire manufacturer in the world. Frank Seiberling was one of the wealthiest men in America, with a fortune estimated in the millions, the equivalent of hundreds of millions today. He had built an industrial empire from borrowed money and abandoned factory buildings in just 14 years. But wealth alone wasn't enough for Frank Seiberling. He wanted something more. He wanted to build something permanent, something beautiful, something that would establish his family's place in American society. He wanted a house worthy of his achievements, not just a mansion, but a statement. An English manor house on American soil, a place where his family could live for generations, where he could entertain in style, where art and culture and business could all come together. In 1911, he began buying land on the outskirts of Akron, not just a lot for a house, but acres and acres, eventually totaling over 3,000 acres, rolling hills, wooded areas, open meadows, and most significantly, several abandoned stone quarries that had provided building material for Akron's 19th century growth. These quarries, cut into the hillsides, would give the estate its name and its character. The name came from Old English, Stan Hywet, meaning stone quarry. It was romantic, historic, and specific to the property. Frank loved English history and culture, and he wanted a name that connected his American estate to old world traditions. Stan Hywet it would be. In 1912, Frank and Gertrude Seiberling did something that would define everything about Stan Hywet. They went to England, not just for a vacation, but on a research trip. They were going to study English manor houses, to understand what made them special, to learn from centuries of architectural tradition before building their own American version. Over several weeks, the Seiberlings toured approximately 20 manor homes across England. They weren't just casual tourists. They took detailed notes, they made sketches, they photographed architectural details, they studied floor plans and room layouts, they examined construction techniques and decorative elements. This was serious architectural research. 3 houses in particular captured their imagination and would serve as primary inspirations for Stan Hywet. The first was Compton Winyates in Warwickshire, a Tudor manor built in the early 1500s with distinctive twisted chimneys and rosy brick walls. The second was Ockwell's Manor in Berkshire, famous for its great hall with massive timber framing and intricate woodwork. The third was Haddon Hall in Derbyshire, a medieval manor with additions spanning several centuries, showing how English houses evolved over time. What the Seiberlings learned from these houses was that the best English manors weren't built all at once to a single plan. They grew organically over generations, with each family adding wings and features as needed. They combined different architectural styles. They used local materials. They were both grand and intimate, formal and comfortable. This organic quality, this sense of historical layering, was what Frank wanted to recreate in Ohio. Back in Akron, the Seiberlings hired Charles Schneider, a Cleveland architect who specialized in English and Tudor Revival styles. Schneider understood what they wanted, not a copy of any single English house, but a new creation that captured the spirit and character of English manor architecture while incorporating modern American needs and technologies. Construction began in 1912 and would take 3 years. The scale was enormous. The main house would contain 65 rooms spread across 64,000 500 square feet. That's more than an acre and a half under a single roof. It would be built primarily of Ohio sandstone and brick with half-timbered gables that were pure Tudor style. The roof would use clay tiles imported from Europe. Every detail would be authentic to the period style they were recreating. But here's where Stan Hywet becomes truly interesting. Beneath the medieval appearance, this was a thoroughly modern house, equipped with the latest technology of 1915. Central heating throughout, using a sophisticated boiler system that could warm every room, even in Ohio's harsh winters. A central vacuum system built into the walls with outlets in every room. You just plugged in a hose and the suction came from a machine in the basement. 3 elevators to move between floors, essential in a house this large, and perhaps most remarkably, a 37-station telephone system that allowed communication between different parts of the house and the estate buildings. Think about that for a moment. In 1915, most American homes didn't have electricity. The majority didn't have indoor plumbing. Telephones were still relatively rare, and Frank Seiberling was installing a private telephone network with 37 stations in his house. This wasn't just wealth. This was a vision of how technology could enhance traditional living. The landscape was equally important to the Seiberlings. They hired Warren Manning, one of America's leading landscape architects, who had worked with Frederick Law Olmsted on projects including Biltmore Estate. Manning's challenge was to transform 3,000 acres of farmland, woods, and abandoned quarries into a coherent designed landscape. Manning's solution was brilliant. He preserved the natural features wherever possible, working with the topography rather than against it. The old stone quarries, which could have been eyesores, became focal points. He transformed them into romantic grottos and recreational areas. One quarry became a natural amphitheater. Another was turned into a swimming pool, essentially a pool carved into the living rock. The formal gardens near the house were inspired by English garden design, but adapted to the Ohio climate and terrain. There was an English garden with herbaceous borders and flowering perennials, a Japanese garden that showed the influence of the aesthetic movement, a breakfast garden where the family could take morning meals outdoors in warm weather, and the Great Garden, a large formal space with a reflecting pool, perfect for entertaining. The entrance approach was designed to build drama, a long winding drive through woods, then suddenly opening to reveal the house on its hill, stone and brick and half-timbering rising against the sky. First-time visitors were meant to be overwhelmed, to understand immediately that they were entering someplace special. Inside, the house was organized around the Great Hall, just like a medieval English manor. This central space rose 2 stories high with massive oak beams supporting the ceiling. The walls were oak paneling, dark with age replicating stain. A huge fireplace dominated one end, with a carved overmantel that incorporated the family coat of arms, or rather, a coat of arms the Seiberlings had designed for themselves, as American families do. The Great Hall served as the heart of the house. It was where the family gathered, where guests were received, where the full grandeur of Stan Hywet was first revealed. The Seiberlings furnished it with a mix of genuine antiques purchased in England and high-quality reproductions, Gothic Revival chairs, medieval-style tapestries, everything chosen to create the feeling that this house had existed for centuries, even though it was brand new. Off the Great Hall were the formal rooms, the music room, the library, the dining room, each decorated in a different but complementary style. The music room was particularly special. Gertrude Seiberling was an accomplished musician, and Frank spared no expense in creating the perfect space for her. The room featured a massive pipe organ with 2,433 pipes hidden behind decorative grillwork in the walls. When the organ played, the entire room vibrated with sound. It was one of the finest residential organs in America. The dining room could seat 30 people comfortably at a single table. The walls were covered in Spanish leather, tooled and decorated in gold. The ceiling was coffered plaster, painted with heraldic designs. The sideboard alone was the size of a small car, carved oak with elaborate detailing. This was where the Seiberlings entertained the industrial elite of America, fellow rubber barons, automobile manufacturers, politicians, artists, and intellectuals. Upstairs were the family bedrooms, each with its own character. character. The Seiberlings had 6 children, 3 sons and 3 daughters, and each had their own room designed to reflect their personality and interests. Frankfurt bedroom suites, as was customary for wealthy couples of the era. Gertrude's suite was more ornate, with delicate furnishings and feminine touches. Frank's was more austere, reflecting his business-minded personality. The house also included spaces that showed how modern life was changing even traditional architecture. There was a billiard room where Frank and his business associates could retreat after dinner, a conservatory filled with exotic plants, multiple bathrooms with the latest fixtures, a luxury in 1915, a sewing room, a schoolroom for the younger children. Stan Hywet wasn't just a showpiece, it was a working home for a large, active family. The Seiberling family moved into Stan Hywet in December 1915, and for the next 15 years, the house was the center of Akron's social and cultural life. Frank Seiberling wasn't just building a company, he was building a vision of how American industrial wealth could create art, culture, and community. Gertrude Seiberling was as important to Stan Hywet's success as Frank. While he focused on business, she made the house come alive. She was involved in music, supporting local orchestras and musicians. She was active in civic causes, particularly women's education and healthcare. And she was an accomplished hostess who could entertain everyone from industrial titans to artists and writers with equal grace. The house regularly hosted elaborate dinner parties and receptions. The Seiberlings' guest list read like a who's who of early 20th century America. Business leaders from across the country came to Stan Hywet to discuss deals and partnerships. The rubber and automobile industries were closely linked, so executives from Ford, General Motors, and other car makers were frequent visitors. But the Seiberlings didn't just entertain business associates. They loved culture and the arts, and Stan Hywet became a venue for performances and cultural events. Professional musicians performed in the music room, taking advantage of that magnificent pipe organ. The Great Hall hosted lectures and presentations. The grounds were used for garden parties and outdoor entertainments that brought together Akron's elite. One of the most memorable regular visitors was Will Rogers, the famous humorist and entertainer. Rogers performed at Stan Hywet multiple times, delighting the family and their guests with his rope tricks, witty commentary, and folksy wisdom. The children particularly loved his visits. Another famous guest was Shirley Temple, who performed at Stan Hywet as a child star. The juxtaposition of America's most famous child actress performing in this mock medieval setting captured something essential about American culture, the constant mixing of old world traditions with new world energy. The Seiberling children grew up in extraordinary privilege, but Frank and Gertrude tried to instill values of work and responsibility. The sons learned the tire business from the ground up, working in Goodyear factories during summers. The daughters received excellent educations and were expected to contribute to society. The family was devoutly Methodist, and religious values shaped their understanding of wealth as a responsibility, not just a privilege. The estate wasn't just the main house. There were numerous outbuildings serving different functions. The gate lodge at the entrance served as offices and guest quarters. There were greenhouses for growing flowers and vegetables year-round. A garage complex that could house multiple cars, essential for a family at the forefront of the automotive age. Workers' cottages for key staff members. A farm that provided fresh food for the household. Stan Hywet was a self-contained community. The grounds offered endless recreational opportunities. There were walking trails through the woods, the swimming pool carved from the old quarry, tennis courts, areas for lawn games like croquet. The Japanese garden provided a peaceful retreat. The formal gardens were constantly changing with the seasons, providing new beauty throughout the year. For the Seiberling children growing up at Stan Hywet, must have seemed like living in a fairy tale. But beneath the surface of this perfect life, storm clouds were gathering. The 1920s were boom years for Goodyear and the rubber industry. The automobile was transforming America, and every car needed tires. Goodyear grew larger and larger, and Frank Seiberling pushed for aggressive expansion. But this growth required enormous amounts of capital, and the company took on significant debt. Frank's management style, which had been perfect for building a company, became problematic as Goodyear became a massive corporation. He was autocratic, making decisions without consulting his board. He took big risks that made investors nervous. He spent money lavishly on research and development, while competitors took more conservative approaches. The board and major investors began to lose confidence in his leadership. The crisis came to a head in 1921. A brief but severe recession hit the American economy. Tire sales plummeted. Goodyear's heavy debt burden became unsustainable. The company needed emergency financing to avoid bankruptcy. Frank Seiberling scrambled to save his creation, but the bankers and investors who provided the emergency funding demanded a price. Frank and his brother Charles had to resign from the company they had founded. It was a devastating blow. Frank Seiberling was 62 years old. He had spent 23 years building Goodyear into the largest tire company in the world, and now it was being taken away from him. The company would survive and thrive, but without the Seiberling brothers at the helm. They were out. For a lesser man, this might have been the end, but Frank Seiberling wasn't ready to retire. He still had Stan Hywet, he still had his family, and he still had his knowledge of the rubber industry. Within months of leaving Goodyear, Frank and Charles started a new company, Seiberling Rubber Company. They would compete directly with Goodyear, building a new tire manufacturing empire. The new company struggled initially. The Great Depression hit hard, and the tire industry was particularly affected as car sales collapsed. Seiberling Rubber lost money for years. Frank had to mortgage Stan Hywet to keep the company afloat. There were times when it seemed he might lose everything, the house, the company, all of it. But the Seiberlings held on. They cut costs. They innovated new products. They found niche markets that larger competitors ignored. And when World War II began, demand for rubber products exploded. The military needed tires for trucks, jeeps, and aircraft. Seiberling Rubber Company got war contracts and suddenly was profitable again. Frank had survived his greatest challenge. On Mother's Day, 1935, something happened at Stan Hywet that would change millions of lives, though nobody present that afternoon could have known it at the time. In the gate lodge at the estate entrance, Henrietta Seiberling, Frank's daughter-in-law married to his son John, brought together two men who were struggling with alcoholism. Their meeting that day would lead to the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous. Henrietta Seiberling was involved with the Oxford Group, a Christian organization focused on spiritual renewal and moral regeneration. She had become concerned about alcoholism, seeing its devastating effects on families and communities. Through the Oxford Group, she met Dr. Robert Smith, Dr. Bob, a surgeon in Akron who was battling his own drinking problem. His medical career was in jeopardy. His marriage was strained. He needed help. Around the same time, a New York stockbroker named Bill Wilson, Bill W., came to Akron on business. Bill was also an alcoholic who had recently achieved sobriety through spiritual means. He was in Akron trying to help found a proxy fight for control of a company, but the deal fell through. Stranded in Akron and feeling the stress of potential relapse, Bill desperately wanted to talk to another alcoholic. He believed that talking to other alcoholics helped him stay sober. Through a series of phone calls and connections, Bill was put in touch with Henrietta Seiberling. She immediately saw the potential. Here were two men, both alcoholics, both seeking recovery, both with something to offer each other. She invited them both to the Gate Lodge at Stan Hywet on Mother's Day afternoon. The meeting lasted for hours. Bill and Dr. Bob talked about their experiences with alcohol, their struggles, their failures, and their hopes for recovery. They discovered that they shared a similar understanding. that alcoholism was a disease, not a moral failing, and that recovery required spiritual transformation and the support of other alcoholics who truly understood the struggle. Dr. Bob had his last drink on June 10, 1930. He and Bill Wilson worked together to develop the principles and practices that would become the foundation of AA. The 12 steps, the 12 traditions, the emphasis on anonymity, the concept of one alcoholic helping another. The movement grew slowly at first, small groups meeting in living rooms and church basements, but the success rate was remarkable. Alcoholics who had been considered hopeless were getting sober and staying sober. By 1939, the group had published its basic text, Alcoholics Anonymous, which laid out the program in detail. The book became known simply as the Big Book, and it has sold millions of copies in dozens of languages. Today, Alcoholics Anonymous has millions of members worldwide. It has spawned numerous other 12-step programs for different addictions and problems. The principles developed by Bill W. and Dr. Bob have influenced addiction treatment, psychology, and self-help movements around the globe. And it all started with a meeting arranged by Henrietta Seiberling in the Gate Lodge at Stan Hywet. The Seiberling family maintained their connection to AA over the years. The Gate Lodge, where that first meeting took place, became a pilgrimage site for AA members. The family welcomed them, understanding the significance of what had happened there. Today, the Gate Lodge is preserved as part of the Stan Hywet Museum, and thousands of AA members visit each year to see where their movement was born. It's one of the great ironies of Stan Hywet's history. This palace built by an industrial baron, this symbol of Gilded Age excess and privilege, became the birthplace of a movement based on humility, spiritual surrender, and mutual support among people struggling with addiction. The wealthy Seiberling family, living in their English manor, facilitated the creation of an organization that would help millions of ordinary people from all walks of life. Frank Seiberling died in 1955 at the age of 96, having outlived most of his Gilded Age contemporaries. He had built 2 major companies, created thousands of jobs, and transformed Akron into the rubber capital of the world. But perhaps his most enduring legacy was Stan Hywet itself. Gertrude had died in 1946, and in his final years, Frank worried about what would happen to the estate after his death. The challenge facing Stan Hywet was the same one facing all the great Gilded Age estates. They were built for a way of life that no longer existed. Maintaining a 65-room house on 3,000 acres required enormous resources. Property taxes alone were crushing. The cost of upkeep, repairs, and staffing was overwhelming. Most similar estates had been demolished, subdivided for development, or converted to institutional uses. The Seiberling family made a remarkable decision. Rather than sell Stan Hywet for development or let it deteriorate, they would preserve it for the public. In 1957, they established the Stan Hywet Hall Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to maintaining the house and gardens as a museum and cultural center. Much of the estate's acreage was sold or donated to generate funds and reduce maintenance costs, but the core 70 acres, including the house and major gardens, were preserved. The transition wasn't easy. Converting a private home into a public museum required significant changes. The house needed updated systems, electrical, plumbing, heating, fire suppression. It needed to meet building codes and accessibility requirements. The collections needed to be cataloged and preserved properly. Educational programs had to be developed. A staff of guides needed to be trained. Funding had to be secured through admissions, donations, and grants. But the foundation succeeded. Stan Hywet opened to the public in 1958, and it has been welcoming visitors ever since. The house remains largely as the Seiberlings left it, with original furnishings, artwork, and decorative objects. Walking through Stan Hywet today is like stepping back into 1915, seeing how one of America's industrial elite families actually lived. The organ in the music room still plays, its 2,400 pipes producing the same rich sound that delighted Gertrude Seiberling and her guests. The Great Hall still awes visitors with its massive timbers and medieval atmosphere. The dining room table is still set with the Seiberling china and crystal. The gardens still bloom with the same varieties of flowers Warren Manning specified over a century ago. Stan Hywet has become one of Ohio's premier cultural attractions, drawing over 100,000 visitors annually. School groups learn about history, architecture, and design. Couples get married in the gardens. Concerts and theatrical performances bring the house alive with sound. Holiday tours show the mansion decorated for Christmas, just as it was in the Seiberling era. The estate serves the same purpose Frank Seiberling intended, bringing together beauty, culture, and community. The preservation of Stan Hywet has had broader significance beyond just saving one historic house. It demonstrated that Gilded Age estates could be successfully transitioned to non-profit status and maintained for public benefit. The Stan Hywet model has been studied and copied by other historic properties. It proved that Americans value these monuments to their industrial past, even with all their complications and contradictions. Because Stan Hywet is complicated, it represents both the best and worst of the Gilded Age. On one hand, it shows remarkable artistry, craftsmanship, and vision. The architecture is superb. The landscaping is beautiful. The decorative arts collection is museum quality. It represents American success, innovation, and the ability to create beauty. On the other hand, it represents extreme inequality. While Frank Seiberling lived in a 65-room mansion with 37 telephones, many of his factory workers lived in modest houses without indoor plumbing. The wealth that built Stan Hywet came from an industrial system that often exploited workers, damaged the environment, and concentrated resources in very few hands. The Gilded Age earned its name from Mark Twain's novel, gilded, not golden beautiful on the surface, but hiding less attractive realities underneath. Modern visitors to Stan Hywet grapple with these contradictions. They admire the beauty while questioning the system that created it. They appreciate the preservation while acknowledging the privilege it represents. This is healthy. Historic houses shouldn't be uncritical celebrations of the past. They should be places where we confront our history honestly, understanding both achievements and failures. Stan Hywet stands today as a monument to an era when American industrial might seem unlimited, when fortunes could be made in a generation, when immigrant families could rise from poverty to palaces. Frank Seiberling's journey from the failure of his father's business to the founding of Goodyear to the building of Stan Hywet to his forced resignation to starting over with a new company, all of it captures the boom and bust nature of American capitalism in the industrial age. The house itself, with its medieval appearance hiding 20th century technology, represents a particularly American impulse, the desire to claim old world traditions while embracing new world innovation. We wanted the romance of English manor houses, but we also wanted central heating, elevators, and private telephone systems. We wanted the pageantry of European aristocracy, but we also wanted the democratic spirit that said anyone could achieve wealth through hard work and innovation. Walking through Stan Hywet today, you can imagine Will Rogers performing in the Great Hall, Shirley Temple singing in the music room, Bill W. and Dr. Bob having their fateful conversation in the Gate Lodge. You can picture the Seiberling children running through the gardens, Frank and Gertrude entertaining hundreds of guests, the bustle of a great house at the height of its glory. But you also see something else, the fragility of it all. Frank Seiberling built an empire and nearly lost everything. The way of life Stan Hywet represented lasted for only a generation before becoming unsustainable. The house that seemed built for eternity needed to be rescued and reimagined as a museum, minimum to survive at all. Yet Stan Hywet endures. The stone quarries that gave it its name remain. The gardens bloom each spring. The organ still fills the music room with sound. Thousands of visitors each year walk through its rooms, stroll its grounds, and connect with a vanished era that still has something to teach us about ambition, beauty, loss, and resilience. Frank Seiberling wanted to build something permanent, something that would outlast him and establish his family's legacy. He succeeded beyond what he could have imagined. Stan Hywet stands not just as one man's monument, but as a window into an entire age, the era when rubber barons built castles in Ohio, when technology and tradition merged in unexpected ways, and when American industrial might transformed the landscape of a nation.